So, welcome to my very first podcast episode. My name is Rana Juita, and I'm super excited to be on this journey with all of you. This has always been my dream to produce a podcast. I wanted to spotlight so many amazing people's work, and where we dive deeper into the conversation about growth, personal development, and as well as mental health, because that's always the cause that I always believe in. And I'm really excited to have my very first guest speaker today because I have always been amazed with his amazing work in the well being space. And I'm really excited to have him on my very first episode. He is none other than Nathan Andres. He's a global well being leader, speaker, coach, and the author of the book Your Real Life: Get Authentic, Be Resilient, and Make It Count. Buckle up as we explore authentic resilience like never before. Let's get started. I'm very excited today because Nathan has just wrote his very first book, Your Real Life: Get Authentic, Be Resilient, and Make It Count. And I've just recently attended his book launch, and it was really amazing and so privileged to have him with us today to share a little bit more about what's in store in the book, and then to get to know him a little bit better, and also to understand a bit more about how we can be resilient, right, and navigate all our life challenges as well. Thank you so much, Nathan, for being here today, and I'm super excited to have this conversation with you.
Radna, thank you very much. I am so extraordinarily honored to be a part of your first show and talk about my first book. And it's great to be here. I can't wait for us to get into the conversation.
I'm super honored to have you here. Nate, tell us a little bit more about you, about your work as well, and why you do what you do.
Yeah, Ratna, thank you for that great first question. I always love talking about myself. I'm kind of an accidental HR leader. I ended up in Asia Pacific, also a little by accident, but I work in human resources. I've been working in HR for about 25 years, doing a variety of different kinds of projects. My specialty has been opening new businesses and planting the flag of culture in many of the new countries and markets around Asia Pacific for various global brands. I'm also a certified coach. And as I mentioned, this is my first book. And I'm hoping that the work that I do as a coach, purpose-driven work, and enabling people to live their most authentic and resilient lives helps people live a life of well-being and joy.
I'm just curious, how do you get so much clarity about your purpose, right? You mentioned about, combining your passion as a coach as well as your well-being leader in, building the resilience and well-being, as well as helping people to find the joy as well. How can you find so much clarity about your purpose?
I stumbled on my purpose about 10, 11 years ago, and it was a jumble of words. I wasn't exactly sure what it would all be, but I knew that resilience, I knew authenticity was part of that formula. I knew that helping other people was part of that formula. What I didn't know was that ultimately that it would shape into being a life that is dedicated to building authenticity and resilience in others. I got to that place over the course of the last few years to really enable myself to get to know who I am and to understand how I wanted to dedicate and work towards helping other people do that. It's a formula that I talk about in the book around how to kind of get there in terms of looking at your core values, looking at your own beliefs, driving and using your strengths, but also thinking about the impact that you want to have. So it's a little bit of the why. It's definitely a little bit of the what and the how in order to hit that impact. For me, it really is about doing this work and sharing my joy and the ability to give back to other people by helping them, unlock those magical tools. I think in the book, you probably read, and thank you for reading the book. I'm honored and flattered that you decided to read that. You'll know that, I spent a majority of my time living inauthentically when I was living in the closet as an LGBTQ person as an LGBTQ HR leader, I spent a lot of time going back into the closet. And what I realized in that experience was that authenticity was one of my core values that's just extremely important. And I recognize that when people actually live authentically in their own lives, they unlock a lot of the challenges that they may be encountering. And the goal is to get to that core so that you can completely unlock. And as I say, is, no matter the closet, open the door principle. It enables people then to really fully live and breathe into that authentic space. And that's what I want for people. Honestly, when people live truly to their core values, and then they start to learn how to build resilience, those two things in combination is a power pack that enables people to get through anything.
That is really amazing. And I really like when you mention about getting back to the closets. And sometimes when you go back to the closets, right, it's quite a scary experience, right? It takes so much courage to be able to lean into that discomfort sometimes. And how did you do that? And what allows you to be able to go back to the closets and really tap into that deeper core within yourself that helps you to unlock?
I put myself back in the closet. And I think that might have been some of the worst advice that I ever received and followed through on, was putting myself back into that closet to hide and to hide myself. And I think that while I did that to look at how I could self-preserve some of my own integrity or my professionalism or the things that I was trying to learn as a professional, I definitely sacrificed some of the personal elements of that. I felt sometimes that I wasn't able to talk about the things I wanted to talk about at work. I wasn't able to participate in all conversations because I was just scared. And I think part of doing the work of getting to know yourself and to really draw on your core values and to know who you are, prior to going back into the closet, I was living very out. I was working in fashion. I was living a very fun and open lifestyle. And when you lose that, you lose a sense of yourself. So for me, doing that work, coming through and opening the door back open enabled me to never go back in that closet. And everyone has a closet. Mine just happens to be an LGBTQ closet. But for many people, it might be that they're a shopping addict, or they've got an alcohol problem, or they've got a disability, or they've got some other kind of piece of their life that they closet away. And when we open the door, no matter your closet, open that door, it unlocks the ability for people to really then live authentically and true to themselves. And when we do that, the idea that well-being from within can flourish.
Wow, that's really powerful. And I also felt the same way as well as I went through my healing journey of really getting back into the closets, something that I felt very ashamed to really share about my imposter syndromes and all sorts of shortcomings that I have, right? And like what you mentioned in your recent post as well, in terms of armor, right? Living without armor will help you feel liberating, right? And how did you overcome that armor? Because sometimes the armor can be quite, close you up, right? How do you deal with it?
Right. Now, that's a fantastic question. And I think when you talk about imposter syndrome, you're talking about one of the side effects of our inner critic. Our inner critic is that negative voice that sits on your shoulder. There's a positive inner nurturer that sits on the other side, but the inner critic is this negative self-talk. It's the one that drives a lot of this negative energy within our own body and our own mind, sometimes somatically living within. And the goal of getting over the imposter syndrome and kind of breaking through that armor is learning how to actually quiet that inner critic and not listen to that inner critic. That inner critic actually is often wrong. And we don't always believe that, But the inner critic is always hypersensitive. And that goes back to some of the neuroscience that is part of this work. And that is that when we look at the neuroscience, the way our brains are actually designed, our lower brains, where our amygdala is constantly scanning for threats. And this goes back to prehistoric days when we were living in the plains and on the desert fields trying to survive as a species. We're constantly looking for all those negative threats, animals that might eat us, and trying to figure out where the bushes are that we can eat. This negativity bias lives very deeply in our brains. And it's what also keeps the amygdala in our brain scanning and constantly thinking about, that negativity bias. And that's what fuels this inner critic. So the goal is to always try to find ways to combat that inner critic. And sometimes for me, it's just like, you're wrong. Just talk back to it. Talk back to that inner critic. No, you're lying. It's not true. And while that sounds and feels a little bit silly, it's actually very helpful, because once we quiet that inner critic, once we learn that inner critic is often wrong and that we should believe and rely on what we were talking about before, those core values and the beliefs that we have in ourselves, and using our strengths, that with that authenticity power is what enables us to break through the armor. And when we break through that, it is liberating. And when you learn about how to build resilience, again, you put these two things in combination, you can get through anything. So it's really about, how do we listen to that inner critic? How do we quiet, choose what we believe, what we don't believe, and then use our core values and our resilience to bust through the closet door, to take off the armor and live really free.
Wow, that was so powerful. I like how you mentioned about, the passing through the armor. I was imagining like some kind of like superhero. I imagine superhero like, coming out with the armor and really break through it. It was just so amazing. And I'm curious to hear, like sometimes, a lot of times, that inner critics can be really overwhelming, especially we live in a very crowded environment where we receive so many information, right? And sometimes it's not very beneficial to our life as well. Is there any ways or techniques you do, right, to be able to quieten down the inner critic?
Yeah, right. I totally understand where you're going with that. And I think that that's an important practice that we need to develop within ourselves. How do you quiet that inner voice? Well, you'll know this very well from the work that you do, Ratna, and that is, meditation, breathing. Those two real biological processes are actually really useful to us to quiet and calm the mind. But I also know that there's science out there in the space of turning off some of the social threats that we experience today. There's so much social media, there's so much media attention, there's so much other kinds of distractions and noise that kind of get bungled up in the spaces that we work today. And the idea is to quiet those. I have a practice where I turn off all of the notifications on my phone. I just don't even turn them on. That way I'm not even tempted to look. There's science that says we look at our phones like about 150 times a day. That's an extraordinary amount of interruptions. What we also know is the science says that when we interrupt ourselves with a distraction, it takes us actually 15 minutes to get back and be focused again on the task at hand. So if we're constantly living in these kind of distracted moments, what's important is for us to actually then figure out how to turn some of that off. That's how I try to do it. And of course, there are other techniques in the book that I talk about, but those are the key ones for today.
I really like you mentioned about the turning off notification. I do that. I've been doing that for a few years already. But interestingly, like for example, WhatsApp, right? Even though we have already not turning off the notification, that keeps popping up again and say, "Hey, would you like to turn on the notification?" And it was like, wow, our world is really being conditioned for us to be able to get addicted to all these, the pings and dings and rings that gets us distracted, right? And then a lot of times we just get too caught up with all these things and forget what's truly matter, right? And I bringing back into, you mentioned about some of the techniques mentioned in the book itself. Tell us a little bit more about your book, your real life, and yeah, share with us some insights about your book, because I've read it like halfway through and I was like, wow, Nate was such having so much resilience, going through so many adversities in your life, through, the 9/11 incidents, to Japanese earthquake, to the blackout and all that. I'm like, I had so much admirations on how do you do that, right? How do you raise up to your adversity?
Yeah, thank you, Ratna, for going all the way in the book. I appreciate you recognizing that, catastrophe and I are friendly. Not everyone has, catastrophe adversities in the same way that I've experienced them. But I think what's important to understand is that resilience is two parts. The first part is really taking back control from an adversity and then learning and growing from that. The second part of resilience is then using that growth to build more capacity in your life, in your experiences, so that when you go up again and face the next adversity, you've got an understanding of what you're using in the things that you've learned before. So resilience is really a key to the power pack of being authentic and resilient. They go together, as we mentioned. The real model is actually a tool that I built that is formulated on 4 key principles that resilient people are able to do with ease. The first is really getting through reality. When we realize that a situation is going to be really challenging or an adversity that we're going to face, the first thing that resilient people do is they look at reality. They evaluate it very quickly and they move through these 4 A's. They acknowledge that an adversity has happened. They move quickly to accept that that has happened. They look for what I call the Advertunity, and then they build an action plan. The faster that they get through that reality curve means the faster that they're going to be able to solve for it. But resilient people also do a second thing really importantly, and that is that they manage their energy. And that's what the E in the model actually stands for. And we talked a little bit about the 4 well-being batteries. And I know you want to talk about the 5th well-being battery of social energy, which we should definitely talk about. But resilient people also know that if they harness the energy that they need to put in the right places, that they can move through that adversity even faster. We talked a little bit about the A, which is authenticity, which is really being purpose-driven and understanding your core values and your core beliefs and using your strengths to drive forward and bust through those armors when you face hard things. When you do that, then you actually have the ability to move faster. And the last part of the model, which is maybe a byproduct of the first 3, is love. And I always advocate, and I've seen resilient people lead with love. When we put love in the formula, it enables us to get through the harder things faster because we're forgiving ourselves. We're creating a communication and a dialogue of language with others and ourselves that's loving. We create a community of people, our network, our counselors and coaches and consultants and people who also want to give us that love. And if we throw in a dash of humor and a little bit of fun, that love creates another way for people to really drive on through. And so when we get real, the fluidity of those 4 anchors enables people to really get through those hardships. And that is what the book is really about, is it takes you systematically through all 4 of those anchors, gives you some real practical tips on how to use the model and how to self-coach yourself through anything.
I really like your point about turning the adversity into opportunity, and you call it Advertunity. I really love that. How do you do that?
So Advertunity is a combination of adversity and opportunity. You're absolutely right. I think in order to understand that, the guy who coined the phrase is a guy, he's a PhD named Paul Stoltz. He wrote a fantastic book called Adversity Quotient, but it's really about looking for the opportunity that's inside the hard thing. And this comes from reframing. If you also are familiar with psychologist Carol Dweck, who wrote a fantastic book about the growth mindset, it's about looking for those positive moments where you can reframe a negative situation. And so, in short, advertunity comes from looking at the opposite side or the darker sides or the shadows of the adversity themselves and saying, how can I flip this into something that's going to be positive? Right before advertunity happens and you lift into that option of how do I build action and put the energy behind the action plan, is the long downward slope of suffering, in the reality curve. That slope of suffering is where anger and frustration and emotions actually live. It's what Dr. Martin Seligman often talks about as learned helplessness. So finding opportunity is really about how do we try to hijack out of learned helplessness to find the positive pieces of an adversity and to use those positive pieces to reframe an action plan that enables us to lift ourselves out of that adverse, hard thing, obstacle, or whatever.
Thanks for sharing that. I really like when you mention about, how we can turn adversity into opportunity by using some reframing, optimism, as well as growth mindset to be able to allow us to make it the best, right? And I just wanted to come back into the first part you mentioned about the energy part, because there are 4 dimensions of energy: the physical, emotional, mental, as well as spiritual. And in my program as well, I actually added the 5th component of the social energy, which I thought it was really very appropriate because we live in this world of, endemic. Loneliness is the endemic, right? And everyone is feeling that way as well. And I'm just curious to hear your thought on social energy.
With no doubt, social energy is a component. I talk about physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual dimensions of energy as well being batteries. These, in my opinion, are the core that supercharge us and can also drain us. And if we're not thinking about how we're managing those 4 dimensions, then I think the consequence is sometimes a drain on the social. And if we're thinking about your question also around loneliness and how social energy can be drained, and that loneliness, I would say that it's probably connected somehow to the low energy, or the red zones, as I like to say, of physical energy, emotional energy. Those 2 play together all the time. So if you're physically exhausted and you're emotionally down, guess what? You're going to be wiped out, right?
Yeah.
In the same ways, mental and spiritual energy also play together. When we are in the shower, for example, taking a hot shower, and we're enabling that physical hot water, and that, energy starts to drive our ability to think. We're thinking about our $1 million idea, and then suddenly we're like connecting that to our purpose. Well, then suddenly physical energy and mental and spiritual energy are all connected. They're fluid in this way. I think that the outcomes of when we're supercharging those batteries or when we're down can definitely affect the social energy that we need to manage. And I love the question, and I've been thinking about this for a while since we talked a few weeks ago around where does that social energy actually live? Is it on the base of the 4 batteries, or is it living above the 4 batteries? I would say that it's probably floating around those 4 batteries, because how we decide where we put our energy, physical energy to interact with someone physically, or emotional energy to interact and have a conversation, or to listen, or to engage, or coach, or consult with someone, all of those are going to play in the sphere of where social energy is going to disrupt or charge those 4 batteries. So I almost think that while it's, for me, the core on the inside, it's the social energy that wraps those 4 batteries and can either supercharge or maybe drain. I'm still thinking about it, and I would love to continue to learn from you about how you talk about it, because I think it's a component that we have to continue to look at, particularly because of the way we live in society today with all of those distractions that we were talking about before.
In a way, accelerate it, right? In a way. Yeah. So like, for example, like your emotional energy, if you use it effectively as well, it also helps you to build your social energy. Like for example, if you do some kind of like activities that recharge your emotional energy, right? And maybe you do it together with someone else that also in a way recharge your
Yeah,
social energy as well. So it can be like a combination of both,
I
and
totally
there's
agree with
this,
that. I mean,
yeah.
when we're talking about feelings and emotions and we use those to like charge up, because sometimes we're drained, but if you do that with someone, it can sometimes boost up and charge up that particular emotional battery. Totally agree with that.
Yeah.
But I think what is interesting about authentic resilience and thinking about energy in that way is it's going to be actually really unique to you. It's going to be based on your value set. Are you an extrovert, introvert? Are you a person that values compassion or is thinking more about how you want to think about generosity? Or are you thinking about family? Or are you thinking about celebration or love? The values will also, I think, dictate. And that's why that the A and the purpose work and the values work is really important to understand, because those will also feed your energy. If social connection, right, and laughter and being with other people, that more extroversion kind of energy, if that's part of the DNA and makeup of you, then absolutely social energy might be an extra battery that you carry that enables you to charge up the other four. If social energy is more introverted, and you actually prefer to be more curious, or, you're a more insular learning or a bookworm, or someone that, actually wants to do more reading or studying, that social energy might be a detraction that drains the battery. So it's a fascinating, we need to talk more about it, because I think when we look at how the social pieces connect and interconnect, all four of those well-being dimensions, and I should say the batteries, they're interconnected. And I no doubt believe that social energy is somewhere in there. How does it sit, or where does it actually, officially function, is, I think, still to be debated.
That's brilliant. And Nate, I'm just curious a little bit more to know a bit more about your work as a well-being leader, because we all know, right, especially after COVID or during COVID, the mental health agenda is being like spotlighted, and all companies find mental health is very important, but a lot of times they don't have budget to actually run some of these well-being initiatives and all that. And some organization, organize it for the sake of doing it, just to tick the box in a way. Playing a little bit devil advocate here, I'm just curious to hear from you, how would your advice be for people or, HR leaders who wanted to implement a well-being strategies in the companies? And how do you convince your senior leaderships to be able to also champion the work as well?
Right. I think that it's a misnomer to believe that everybody has loads and loads and buckets of money to invest in well-being and mental health in the workplace. But I will tell you, actually, what's really important is that today, 8 out of 10 prospective employees are actually looking at what employers and corporations actually do in their well-being and mental health resources before they even apply for a job. And as they go through that interview process, this is according to the American Psychology Association, before they even apply and get involved in that application and interview process, they're already thinking about, what do you offer at your company? So I would say, firstly, what's really important is that corporations and companies around the world start to prioritize what they're going to do with their well-being and mental health space, because it becomes a really important competitive advantage. But the logistics of how do you do that? So, okay, HR leaders, what you really need to do is think about this. You need to be thinking about the kind of culture that you want to create. And if we put well-being in the center of that culture, then a lot of really interesting things can blossom from that. It's also where diversity, inclusion, justice, equity, all of these things then can really start to thrive when we create a culture where people can show up into the office and feel their full authentic selves, feel their whole selves come to work. Because I've said many times, the whole person shows up at work. Okay, so what do we do? The first thing is that we need to engage the top leaders. When we look at how well-being can be a priority, and when we know that if everyone's coming to work feeling great, they're going to do great work, then senior leaders should hopefully prioritize that. And when they do, and they're in the meetings and they're also co-sponsoring programs and or doing some of the training, or they're guest speakers on some of the panels, that's going to lend a much higher credibility to them to then be forceful in saying this matters, this is a priority. But HR teams and global well-being people who are leading this work also have to engage, the grassroots level at the front line, and ensuring that people are being heard, that there's listening happening, and that we are making and creating programs that actually are useful and relevant to the people who actually need them. And in the middle, what's really important is doing work around training your managers, training your middle management in how to have the well-being conversation. It is a important conversation. And if managers are just managing and not really talking to people, then there's a gap. And when you're trying to help manage people's well-being, it's a two-way street. It's the employees have to take accountability, but management needs to create the environment. We also know that about 81%, according to a study with the Workable folks, they said that 81% of employees actually want to make sure that their employer is responsible for their mental health and well-being journey. And there's another interesting percentage that is associated saying that the workplace is the first stop in many people's mental health journey. Well, that's a tremendous burden and a new way that management needs to think about how they are partly responsible for creating an atmosphere in a workplace environment that is conducive for people doing their best work.
Yeah.
So it's a several pronged approach, right? It's working with the top. It's also making sure that you engage with, the very front line, and then making sure that you train up the middle so that everyone is really engaged in creating culture.
That is so powerful, Nate. I think a lot of all these HR leaders and people managers should really listen to this podcast, right? And I think it's really important to be able to really prioritize our, employees' well-being, building that as the heart of the culture, to be able to help people to bring their whole self to work, and to be able to also, showing up with so much courage, so much purpose to work as well, right? And that's bring me to the very last questions I have for you, just to conclude this conversation. If you have a conversation with your younger self, right, on the journey that you have taken to where you are today, what kind of advice or insights would you share to all of us?
Thank you for that last question. This has been such a great conversation so far. I think talking about conversations that I would have with my younger self, we talked a little bit about my own journey with catastrophes and adversities and, battling the LGBTQ closet and some other things. I think I've said before, what one of the things that has been eye-opening as I reach 50 years old. I know it's hard to believe. That
you don't look like
that the wisdom comes. Part of the wisdom would be to impart back to my younger self would be about being more courageous and living my truth. And I've said also, in other conversations with people that I wish I would have found my coaches and people in my life to help mentor me and grow me earlier in my career. And I think that's what's really important as we go through our lives, to not only pay it forward, but to impart that wisdom and ignite and hopefully inspire young people, younger leaders, younger middle management to grow, but also to bust through the armor, as we said, open that closet door, deal with some of the hard things that they have to deal with, but also live your truth, and live authentically and use the hard things, right? And this happens a lot. I wish someone would have told me this was take those hard things that you're experiencing at work, or take the hard feedback or take the projects that you're like, I don't want to do that. Take those and lean into them because it's in those places that we actually learn the most. That's where resilience is born. And when you combine that with knowing who you are and being who you are, you be unstoppable. And when you throw that into a cauldron of courage, you have a good friend, Martin Stark, who's in Australia. He's a courage coach. When you throw this all together, then you can really grow and thrive, not only in your career at work, but also in your life. And ultimately, that's the thing that leads to well-being and joy.
Wow, that was so powerful. And as you shared that, I just felt goosebumps. And I just felt, the people who have went through those shit moments and those adversity will be able to come out with so much profound wisdom and, insights to be able to really light the world from the inside out, right? And you have done it so amazingly, Nate. It's just such a profound, it's such a pleasure and privilege for me to be able to interview you today. And thank you so much for sharing so much wisdom